Hello and welcome to the latest of our Imperial War Museum Hindsight in 2020 talks. I'd like to apologise for our late start, which is entirely my fault. I was trapped in a cab without my laptop. Not very rock and roll, I know, but at least we did the Rolling Stones thing and kept the audience in an extraordinary state of suspense. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to chat to our panelists, our distinguished panel, for about half an hour, and then you'll get a chance to chip in. There's a question box at the bottom right side of the screen, and you can type in your questions there when invited to do so. Those of you who've seen the talks before know that we've covered a whole range of themes. We've looked at coronavirus and the language of war. We've looked at how it's affected the refugee crisis. We've looked at things like UK-Chinese relations, all sorts of aspects of what's going on at the moment, but critically, how they reflect back into history and what we can learn from history in terms of our current interpretation of what we're living through. And that, of course, is especially relevant with today's subject, which is about disinformation and its effects on society and on our public discourse. Now, of course, it doesn't take much imagination to think back to the way that disinformation and misinformation, we'll explore the difference between those two shortly, were exploited, for example, during the period of the two world wars, both with those Germans bayoneting babies type stories, and of course then through the systematic anti-Semitic ideology of the Third Reich. And of course, one can think of other examples as well of use in political warfare. The Zinoviev letter in 1924, produced by British intelligence in an attempt to swear an election, so it's believed by many, and even more recently. But I won't dwell into that because I think that's something we can get into with our panel. And so without further ado, I'll introduce them. Welcome to you, Professor QUASSIM CASSAM, who is the professor of, well, your key thing is your latest book, I suppose I should plug, which is called Conspiracy Theories, but he is at the University of Warwick as well, which is where his professorship is. NINA SCHICK, welcome, Nina, familiar to Newsnight viewers, but she's here as well. She has a book out which couldn't be more aptly focused, Deep Fakes and the Infocalypse. I don't know whether I've pronounced Infocalypse or Infocalypse correctly, but that's the title. And then joining us also is Professor JEAN SEATON, who has the chair of media history at the University of Westminster and who has been on one of our previous panels. She's also director of the Orwell Prize. So welcome to you all and to you, the audience. What we're going to do in essence is we're going to try and define our disinformation problem initially, and our propaganda issue, and what it is exactly we're talking about and what its manifestations are in the current context and their historical resonances. And then we'll go on to look at whether there are actual remedies or ways of actually dealing with the problem. So Nina, if I could ask you to maybe kick off. I mentioned earlier misinformation versus disinformation. Could you help us to just understand what the difference is and the meaning of those terms?
Well, essentially, they're both types of bad information. To distinguish, disinformation is bad information that is made with the intent to deceive, whereas misinformation is simply bad information that doesn't necessarily have a deceptive intent behind it. It can be spread naively, but they're both forms of essentially bad information. Both can be as dangerous as the other.
Right. And in terms of current manifestations, Professor QUASSAM, what would you guide us to in terms of the key manifestations in our present discourse of disinformation and misinformation?
Well, conspiracy theories, I think, are a good example of certainly misinformation and in many cases disinformation. So if you think about conspiracy theories about the spread of COVID-19, a lot of that, I think, is in fact disinformation by Nina's definition.
Where does something like the QAnon movement, if people who are watching have heard of that but aren't sure exactly what it is, maybe you can enlighten us a bit.
Yeah, so QAnon is a very kind of strange conspiracy theory that's been put forward by an anonymous online person called Q, back in 2017. And it's a very weird theory, but basically the idea is that senior Democrats and celebrities and other members of the so-called elite are working together in a global pedophile sex trafficking ring, which includes, among other things, harvesting the blood of babies who are trapped in underground tunnels. And the person, the hero who is going to sort all of this out, who is busy unearthing this conspiracy, is none other than President Trump. So you have the villains in that conspiracy theory, which is basically, the elites, and the hero, who is Trump. So that's how it all started, but it's kind of morphed into a much wider attempt to promote, basically every conspiracy theory known to man now seems to be associated with QAnon.
Right, it's become a sort of receptacle for pretty much everything going. JEAN Seaton, why don't you come in? Because I think you can help us really in the context of propaganda and how these deliberate distortions of fact fit in with political messaging and the attainment of political objectives.
Well, propaganda started out, it's perhaps worth remembering that propaganda started out actually as a quite neutral term. I mean, it comes from the Catholic Church's attempt to propagate the church. So it started out as a kind of neutral term and it became negative. And I think that propaganda, it's a very slippery thing because it depends, one man's propaganda is another man's truth. But propaganda is the deliberate, the easiest way of getting it somewhere is that it's more like disinformation, misinformation rather than disinformation, because it's the deliberate attempt to persuade, to use images and emotions and information in a way to achieve a particular political end, which is not apparent to those that consume it. So I think there's an element of, and he may then pass it on. We lived through two very clear and very enormously successful propaganda machines, one of which was communism, one of which was fascism. They were both jolly successful. Propaganda is very successful. And arguably we're now in a new stage in which there are political players, and I really don't want to play that down, but there are also, as it were, huge misinformations which are emerging from commercial needs and necessities, which look a little bit less nasty until you get close to them. So propaganda is the attempt by anything really to persuade you in ways that you can't see, to do things or believe things, and those are quite complicated. Relationship, belief and action is jolly complicated and quite interesting. But I would just say that propaganda has actually been rather successful.
Yeah, I mean, let's pick up on what JEAN's been saying, Nina, in the sense that listening to her, a lot of what she was describing, right from the Catholic Church, the attempt to excite emotion and to mobilize people and thought, is in a sense core to normal political messaging in a democracy, isn't it? I mean, one can think of certain party or presidential broadcasts, campaigning videos that do all of those things and are perhaps rather partial in their selective use of fact. So I guess what we're talking about today is conscious dishonesty. Is that it? Or do you think sometimes the propagators of misinformation don't even accept that what they might be putting out is not true?
I think what we're facing today is different. And the reason why it's different, because if you look at history, disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, conspiracy theory, they're not new. These are phenomena that have existed for as long as human society has existed. What's different now is that the architecture of our information ecosystem has changed very dramatically in the past 30 years. And society simply has not been able to keep up with those changes. So to the extent where I argue in my book, in the age of information, our actual entire information ecosystem has become increasingly corrupt, increasingly dangerous and untrustworthy, to the extent where we're facing a crisis of bad information in all its manifestations, whether that's propaganda, conspiracy theory, mis or disinformation, at a level that we've never seen before historically. And technology has made this possible, not because the technology itself is bad, but because the technology is an amplifier of human intention, right? So not only are we all in this one ecosystem where any piece of information can go viral immediately, but technology is also democratizing the means to create the most sophisticated types of visual manipulation. I, in my book, look at deepfakes, which I argue is the next evolving threat. This is literally the ability of AI to generate fake media, including fake video and audio, that's as sophisticated as the real thing. And experts who I speak to, we're on the cusp of the age of synthetic media, and experts who I speak to think that in about 5 to 7 years' time, 90% of video content online will be synthetic, so fake or generated by AI. And that is happening at a time when video is the most important medium of human communication. We are wired to want to look at something that looks right. We're psychologically wired to look at a piece of visual evidence and want to believe that it's true, even if it's not. So visual media is far more compelling as a tool of disinformation than anything written, than the written word. So my entire premise is that the only way we start to deal with what seems increasingly a crisis of bad information, not only in the political realm, but also, in the business realm, affecting private citizens in their lives, is by understanding it within this conceptual framework of what I call the infocalypse, this increasingly dangerous information ecosystem. And the only way we begin to address it is first by understanding it, and then thinking about the technical and societal solutions we need to develop to address it. And the time, I argue, is now, because things are about to get a lot hairier in the next 5 to 10 years when we start seeing.
Well, if I can just slightly rein you in, because we're going to do proposed solutions in a moment. But just before we go further into that, can I just bring Qassim in again? Is it right? I mean, just picking up on some of the points Nina made, that essentially, because of the quantity of information out there now, that our sort of societal consensus about what is or isn't a truth may be breaking down, and that creates a uniquely fertile plane or ground for info and disinformation.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, one interesting question I think is if you think about currency. So at the moment, if you look at the pound coin in your pocket, you might think, well, that's a pound, and you know it's a pound, even though you know there are some counterfeits around. But if you get to the point where 90% of all the coins in circulation are counterfeit, as the analogy would be with 90% of online content as being counterfeit. Well, of course, in that case, when you look at a coin in your pocket, you really have no reason at all to think that it's genuine, or very little reason, because there'd be a 90% chance that it's not genuine. So if something similar happens with online content, where we become familiar with the idea that the vast majority of stuff that we see online is actually fake or manufactured, I think what would happen in that case is that we just would begin not to rely on this stuff, just as we would have to not rely on the bits of metal in our pocket if there were lots of counterfeits. So I think our whole relation to visual images would change quite fundamentally if things reached the stage that Nina was describing.
I think there was a key moment. I mean, if you look back to the Cold War, the key thing that the Russian leaders had their dashers where they could hear the BBC World Service. So they spent most of their money trying to keep the World Service out from their populations, but they wanted to know what was really happening, and the BBC was a very good source of that. And there is a lie to that, an assumption that societies need reality to function, that there is a sort of substrate, and that has an inbuilt skepticism about material, and that in some sense, you can't turn on the light unless there is a sort of agreed set of rules and realities and regulations that produce that. And the issue is whether that is, I mean, my view is that's still true, that governments can't function without some real understanding of what's going on. And COVID is, in a way, the big opportunity to clean up the information system, because it certainly is the big, as it were, prophylactic reform that we need. But there is a sort of question about whether whether various states could run systems entirely on no knowledge whatsoever that was real. So I think there is a historic question, and Nina is right, it's a completely different world. But there is the substructure, not just what people understand, but just how you can keep things going if you don't have relatively accurate information.
I mean,
Jean, you're reminding me that towards the end of the Soviet period, I was having a drink at an embassy party with a Soviet diplomat, and he denounced Radio Free Europe as blatant propaganda. And he inveighed against it. And then I said, what about the BBC? He goes, it's subtle propaganda. But sadly, those days are gone, aren't they? And, dare one say it, the BBC, particularly in certain countries, has now become an object to be scorned by certain authoritarian leaders, or the attempt to undermine the legitimacy of its message is all part of this post-truth, or whatever you want to call it, period that we're living through. Nina, can I now come back to you, having slightly arrested you in mid-flight when you were talking about the possible mitigations or solutions to this? I mean, a lot of people say that the attitude of Facebook or Twitter is making all this worse because they haven't policed disinformation or false information in the way they should have done. Do you think they hold any kind of answer in terms of combating the deep fakes you were talking about? Is it possible through algorithms and other methods that would almost be machine learned that they could simply disable such deep fakes before they gained any real currency? Well, so with the platforms and the AI solutions, they absolutely play a role in regards to the solution. With the platforms, because they have become immensely powerful in this information ecosystem, and they're not accountable to anyone apart from their stakeholders, right? But I always say that it's this, when it comes to solving the infocalypse or the corrosion of our information ecosystem, it's actually a far broader problem than that. It's a society-wide problem. And there's two kind of columns of solutions. One are the technical solutions. So building the AI software to detect deep fakes. That is already underway, although the deep fakes, there is a question whether the AI software can ever be good enough to detect all the fakes because of the adversarial nature of the AI. So as soon as the detector gets good enough to detect the fakes get better at generating. So you're in this never-ending cat and mouse game. There's never one detector for all deepfakes. The second technical solution is building into the architecture of the information ecosystem provenance. So for everything like a journalist to be able to say this content is authentic. So, and the way that you do that is you embed it into the hardware of the device. So the camera, the mobile phone by which the video was recorded, every journalist or everybody who has a stake in showing that their media is authentic, it is showing the truth, to have like in the architecture of the ecosystem provenance. Then the second set of solutions, and this is where things start getting very difficult, are the society-wide solutions. These are the things like what does civil society do? What do policymakers do? What do regulations do? Because all I can say is that we're living in society 3.0 when it comes to the architecture of our information ecosystem, but the rules and regulations are still far behind, where they're still kind of made for the analog age. And this is particularly important, I think, for liberal democracies, because as Jean correctly pointed out, I think that
if you are a liberal democracy, if you have no agreement on a concept of an objective truth, then I think that's an existential threat to our Western societies and the ways that we live. Where it's, of course, immensely powerful is for authoritarian regimes, right? If you have no truth, then the only thing that matters is power and who has the power to control the narrative. So I would say that this is, because it's an existential threat to liberal democracies, this is something I think that first needs to be conceptualized, and then both the technical and societal solutions need to be developed as a point of priority, because I think by the end of the decade, unless we start getting a handle on our information ecosystem, things are going to look very much worse, especially with the age of synthetic media.
Qassim, I just want to bring you in. Obviously, Nina is couching this, but in part because I asked her about the big tech companies very much in terms of what can be done in terms of online mitigations and what role they might play. But I just wonder about, in a sense, the human condition. Reading the books that Peter Pomerantsev has written in the last few years, the first of which had this title, "Everything is Possible and Nothing is True," about the way that Russian information or political technologists deliberately corrupted what was true by producing all sorts of plausible counter theories. And then we also hear it said that the aim in relation to Western democracies of Russian actions has been simply to undermine faith in the institutions and cause everybody to doubt what they're being said. I just wonder, in terms of the human condition, if that genie is now completely out of the bottle, or there's anything that can be done to restore faith, given the sort of siloed way that people are consuming their information these days.
Well, I think it's not just a question about, consumption of information or, Russian interference or whatever. I mean, I think it's really a question about political culture generally. I think it's no accident that what we've been witnessing is the rise of populism. And populism I think of as sort of, the politics of resentment against elites. And once that becomes prevalent, that sort of resentment is going to express itself in all sorts of different ways, including suspicion of the mainstream media and suspicion of people in power and so on. And so, when you then have people, calling into question mainstream sources of information, people are very receptive to that. But they're receptive to that, not just because of some human kind of fallibility, but because we're living in a political climate where large numbers of people are extremely skeptical now about, the establishment, so-called, or the elite, so-called. And unless that problem is addressed, the issue of populism it's I think going to be quite difficult to address these more technical questions about the media and information and so on.
I mean,
Jean, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say two things. One of which is that Bernard Williams' absolutely wonderful book on truth, which is now really old, but he thought he was answering a very particular problem actually around theory and society and history. But in a way, he was writing a manifesto about the problems about sincerity, the problems of a much bigger book than he ever knew. And somewhere in the middle of that, he said that if you start to, once things start to fall apart, discussions will dwindle away into torpid cynicism. And that there is that real danger. The thing that I wanted to go back to is there are some things, for instance, there's a bill going through, we have a new information bill. It is absolutely appalling. It's the equivalent of going through the British Parliament. It's the equivalent of basically giving the police the 10 commandments and allowing them to write the laws. I mean, it says basically have a duty of care. I mean, fine, great. What's that mean? So I think I'm certainly less pessimistic because, making that, it's very clear what you need to do. You need a transparent regulatory policy, you need transparent good and bad information markers. There are things, despair, as it were, is just what the conspiracy people, as it were, want to induce. And I think that it would, presumably both the Chinese and the Russian governments do know some things accurately. about their societies, because otherwise even they can't survive. Erdogan knows some things accurately. In fact, in some ways, they know more things accurately. So the dangers of censorship and manipulation are much bigger. So I'm an unreasonable reason person in this current climate, but I also think that if you give up on, for instance, there are lots of people beginning to make a lot of money out of trying to, because it's a commercial space, produce algorithms that are in the public interest. There's a lot of money to be made out there in that. Now, I couldn't make an algorithm in the public interest, but probably they can, and if they made it, they might make a lot of money. So there are these other things happening around the system.
But for those who haven't heard of algorithms in the public interest before, like me, what can you give us an example?
Well, both of the other speakers have in a sense written about that, but at the moment,
So this is like finding deep fakes and stuff like that.
yes, or at the moment, all algorithms that are running things like TikTok, which is the next big danger in a way for different reasons, give you more of what you already want. That's how they make their money. They make you money by maximizing the number of clicks and maximizing giving you what you've already said you want. And it's just a very old-fashioned founding principle of the BBC that people need what they need as well as what they already think they want. So if you could just discombobulate the information that people were given so that it didn't just accentuate what they were given, but gave them something else as well.
Yeah. So the point that Jean's just made. So my kids showed me that with YouTube, if you watch a video about the idea that the World Trade Center was blown up by the Americans, the next videos that it selects for you will usually be a selection of conspiracy theories, either about the World Trade Center or more broadly drawn. Now that presumably is central to their business model. So how on earth would algorithms in the public interest, as Jean's just explained them to us, be enforceable or applicable in a commercial context like that?
Well, if they start to lose money, because
sorry, maybe Kassim, yeah.
Well, I mean, clearly, as things stand, their recommendation algorithms work in just the way that your kids described, and as long as that's financially beneficial to them, they're not going to change them unless they are pressurized by regulators into changing them. So, I mean, I think that's an area where an element of regulation might need to come in, but it's actually very hard when you get down to specifics to see how you can do it, how you can enforce these things in a way that's compatible with free speech and so on. But that would be one avenue to go, which is to pressurize these companies to actually change their recommendation algorithms. But beyond that, there are lots of other things that you need to do. I mean, there's a fundamental issue of trust here. I mean, supposing you tell the public, look, we've got this technical software now that ensures that images that are real are marked as real, so they're sort of certified as real, so you can tell whether the stuff you're looking at is real or not. Now, of course, if you're talking to someone who doesn't have trust in the system or trust in the establishment, they're going to say, well, yeah, but they could be fake too, right? What assurance do we have that the stuff that you are marking is real is really real? And I think that's just an illustration of the point that actually when you're dealing with someone who is deeply skeptical, someone who buys into conspiracy theories, these sorts of maneuvers are not really going to be any substitute for the restoration of trust, because someone who is determined to mistrust and question what you do is going to mistrust and question your technical solutions to the problem. So it really does boil down to the question of trust. And I think that if you're thinking about the world today compared to the world 20 or 30 years ago, at least in the West, I mean, the big thing that's changed is that levels of trust, not just in politicians, but generally in the professions, has declined. Levels of trust in politicians, in journalists, in doctors, and that I think is the underlying issue here. So I think the deeper question is, how has that happened? Why has it happened? And what can you do about it? But unless you really address that, that fundamental question, I think all this technical stuff that we've been talking about, although helpful, is not really going to be the solution, seems to me.
I'm going to make two quick service announcements now. The first is that some of you may have noticed that Nina Schick has had to leave us. She's in such high demand that she's had to join another Zoom seminar going on. But we are still going to carry on for at least another 10 minutes. And you, my second announcement is, can join in or ask questions of Qassim and Jean by using the box at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Now, we've got one here, which is someone points out the issue is reliability. Also, the amount of information aiming to deceive, very difficult to filter out propaganda and disinformation. It's time-consuming and intellectually exhausting. Now, this is one of the things that we've noticed in our business with the fact-checking of people's speeches or whatever, whether that's President Trump or whether it's Putin or whoever it is that by the time you've fact-checked it and shown its limitations, you're 3 or 4 news cycles on, or he's made some other comments that people are now taking issue with. So is it actually possible in Nina's infocalypse to swat away disinformation, Jean?
I'd say that there are two systems. In an odd way, there are two systems operating at the moment. So one system is that you can destroy a reputation because there's honor and you can misinform people, and something collapses. And the other system seems very resistant to what you might call fact checking. It doesn't matter. And those are two sort of parallel systems. And I don't think, at its crudest, you can get rid of Hillary Clinton, lots of other issues, by one email she got wrong, and obviously other politicians like Trump can do things that were previously being seen as absurd. So that it's as if there's these two parallel systems, and I don't really understand the political gearage between them at the moment. And I think, I think
associated, yeah.
I think there's gearage, but I think so. And the other thing I just would say is that if you look at very big states like China, it's very concerned to have extremely gobsmackingly sophisticated information about its citizens, which it is using in completely novel ways. You get more social credits if you snitch on somebody. It's like Eastern Germany on steroids. But they want to know that they believe there is something real there that they want to keep their eyes on. And I in a way, that's optimistic.
I mean, Jean, I've got a question that's directed to Qassim, so we should switch over to him now. It's from Amelia. Could you say more about the 3 distinctions you make between propaganda: ideals-based, affective-based, and identity-based?
Yeah, so this is really an answer to the question, how does propaganda work? And it works in lots of different ways. So there's some propaganda that works by appealing to ideals that people have. So take back control, for example, I think is a form of ideals-based propaganda. So it's appealing to this ideal of self-mastery or control that people have, and trying to sell the idea that Brexiting would be a way to take back control. Then there's affective propaganda, which is propaganda that works fundamentally by manipulating people's emotions or appealing to people's emotions. So through visual images that have an emotional appeal. And then there's identity-based propaganda, which is appealing to people's social or group identity. It's sort of us and them propaganda. Now, of course, propaganda can have all these features all at the same time. But the basic idea is that when you're thinking about propaganda, you need to think about the particular mechanisms by which by which it works. And also think, I mean, going back to the earlier discussion, also think more about whether propaganda has to be false. I mean, if you think about, Allied propaganda against the Nazis in the Second World War, I mean, a lot of that propaganda, highlighting the evils of the Nazis, what wasn't false, it was true. But it was still, it was still a form of propaganda. And if you ask, well, why is that? Well, it was a form of propaganda because it was fundamentally an attempt to affect people's beliefs and preferences by manipulating their emotions. So I think that's the key. That's the key to propaganda. It's really changing minds not by rational argument, but by emotional manipulation, and that can be for good causes, or it can be for bad causes.
Yeah, we've got a few more questions now. I might as well give the first to Jean, as Qassim's just had a crack at the last one, which is from Alan. Starting to see social media companies under pressure to behave better from advertisers. Now, before we were talking about regulation, you were saying, both of you, that it's intrinsic to their business model to compile things in the way they do. But is Alan's point rather a good one, that perhaps the key pressure point could be advertisers?
Well, I'm on the board of an organisation called Full Fact, which has been doing fact checking for a decade. And one of the things, but this is really the small change, the big platforms, Facebook and Google, are worried about the reputational damage. And probably their founders are a little bit worried about the impact they've had, a little bit, because they have discombobulated the whole political system. I think that in answer to that, I think that, being associated with obviously false information, so that, anti-vax, let's just take that to the obvious thing, that then sells you your shoes. Then you can pressurize the shoe seller. That's not a very good place to advertise. So if one could get that going, that actually, so you impose the kind of standards we have on advertising in the heritage world back out there, and you hit companies where it hurts. So I think there is, I think that's another strand of this is a very big problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's another strand of what we could do.
Right, I'm gonna bat this one back to Qassim. Andrew Carpenter's got a question. Effective strategies for reducing the influence of populism in the UK, US, or other political cultures, he says. But let's just focus on UK and US, as we're an English-speaking webcast here.
Well, an incredibly tough question. What I would say is that it's going to be a long, hard road. I mean, if you think about, the current populist upsurge, how do you explain it? I think there was a huge loss of trust in the political establishment, both in the UK and in the US, actually, particularly after the Iraq War, after the 2003 Iraq War. So I think that and the perceived failure of the political class in both countries over the years has really led to an upsurge in populism. So that implies that actually, if you to do something about this, you're going to have to basically restore trust in the political class, restore trust in the so-called establishment, and to do that, that trust has to be earned. I think people are going to have to be convinced over a long period of time that the political class isn't as useless as they now think they are, that the journalists aren't as useless as lots of people think they are, and that's going to be a long, hard road. I mean, I don't think it's impossible, but I equally don't think that there's some magic solution to this. It's going to have to be a case of actually convincing people that their trust is deserved.
I suppose if you're a pessimist, you can look at the 20s and 30s and say, well, a cautionary experience is what it takes to restore the trust in sort of rather grey political figures and to undermine the force of populism. Jean, I've got a question here from Emma Holdsworth, and this is, I suppose, it's on a slightly different tack. Could one say today's standards, such as standards of beauty, masculinity, femininity, or family, are a form of propaganda in our societies? Is advertising even a form of propaganda?
A lot of the most, so it's a really fascinating question. A lot of the most interesting work really on propaganda came out of people right the way back to the 20s, thinking about the way in which advertising worked. So advertising and propaganda and advertising soap and advertising politics have always been much more integrated. And a lot of the lessons have come from the trying to sell you soap. So yes, advertising is a kind of propaganda, and I'm so old I can remember the old arguments in which it said it was a propaganda for capitalism. It inspired in you needs that you didn't know that you had. That was the classic argument. Capitalism needed new needs, and it made you feel anxious about how you smelt or how you looked, and therefore it then sell you something to mitigate your misery at smelling or not looking right, which has a point. So I do think that advertising is a kind of propaganda, though we have, different regimes have come to different, we have advertising standards here, and actually that's rather a good regulatory body, unlike the Electoral Commission, which I think is not a very good regulatory body at the moment. Whether you would say that clearly populism seems to me does have a link to masculinity, in the sense that and many of the real resentments and regrets and senses of loss, which I think Qassim was really hinting at. Populism doesn't emerge out of anywhere. I would say it was the financial crash, but there are, or perhaps as well, but I think that it did, it produced real disadvantages, that some people bore, and that have to be corrected. So I don't think that either Hitler or communism worked on non-real resentments. I think they had real resentments to work on, but they did things with them that didn't solve those problems. Beauty and femininity, I want to leave the family in a way. The family has always been part of propaganda, both the communists and the Nazis backed themselves up a cul-de-sac because they'd had such a profound propaganda about the family that they couldn't get their women out to work. Whereas we had a much more lax thing, and all of our women were pushed out to work. So there are relationships very deep relationships between particular ideologies and sexualities and families. Those all feel to me, at least here, much more interestingly in flux. So, we're
going to have to leave the audience on a theme of flux then, Jean, because I'm afraid we're pretty much out of time, and I've been asked to bring things to a halt by our webmaster. So JEAN SEATON and QUASSIM CASSAM, thank you both indeed very much, professors both, for your erudite exploration of this month's topic. Next month, the talk is on or the webcast, I should say, on the 22nd of October, and it's America First, on the subject of US global leadership, obviously in a couple of weeks before the US presidential election. That's all for this Hindsight in 2020 talk. We are open again. We started these talks back during the deep dark days of lockdown. The Imperial War Museum is open again, so please visit. Whether you do or don't, feel free also to support us, and you can go to the website to www.iwn.org, and then it's .uk/support us, with a hyphen between the support and us, /donations. But for this Hindsight in 2020 webcast, thank you all very much indeed for joining us.